Well, how you doing? This is Caleb Jones, and this is the Sovereign CEO podcast, where we talk about how you can create your own location-dependent income, move to a less bad country, or at least set up an international plan B, and do all these things for very little money. And it's interesting. I was planning my trip back to the United States. I got to go back. 2 or 3 more years, I don't have to go back. But right now, I got to go back. My lovely wife is still trapped in the Portland, Oregon area. So I go back there in early February. A few more months and she's done. A few more months and she's here in Dubai. We're counting down the days. But I fly back. I'm in Dubai now. I fly back to the U.S. Early February. And I just found out this morning of this recording that Emirates, the primary airline that flies in and out of Dubai, one of the best ranked airlines in the world, probably not, if not the best airline in the world, has canceled all flights to all U.S. cities except for 3. There would be L.A., JFK in New York, and then Washington, D.C. So Miami, Chicago, Houston, Dallas, Seattle, they've canceled all these flights. Cerveza sickness? Is that why? No, not cerveza sickness, 5G. So apparently there is a big confusion in the United States regarding the dangers of 5G. Apparently some people believe, so the FCC says 5G is perfectly safe. The FAA says that no, it can interrupt with a plane's ability to measure how high it is, especially when it's landing. And so if you land a plane, you don't know how high it is, that might be a problem. Who's right? Who's wrong? Who the hell knows? Doesn't matter. But I'm just sitting there going, all right, guys, let's just keep screwing all this up. This is great. Awesome. That's awesome. Now, the way that affects me is Portland, Oregon, or the Portland, Oregon area. Pink Firefly, thank God. Her apartment is not in Portland, nor what I want it to be. It's in the Portland area, though. So what I normally do is I take a direct flight from Dubai to Seattle, and I take a very nice, very beautiful 2.5-hour train ride down to Vancouver, Washington area where Pink Firefly still has her apartment. And it's pretty convenient. It works pretty well. The problem is I won't be able to do that, most likely, because you can't fly to Seattle anymore because of 5G. Great. So the next closest airport is LAX. Just one problem. As I've talked about many times before, LAX is the single worst airport in the entire United States. It is the worst airport in the United States. It is possibly, although I don't think so, possibly the worst airport in the entire Western world. Matter of fact, I would probably rank it as the second worst airport in the entire Western world. I would probably put Stansted Airport in the UK as the worst airport in the Western world, but LAX is a pretty close second. It is basically designed to be inefficient, and it's terrible. So every time I fly, I tell my staff, please keep me the hell away from LAX. No layovers in LAX. Don't land me in LAX. No, I don't want to get anywhere near LAX. Please, God, no. I will pay extra money to avoid LAX. And I have. Now, there are rare, weird exceptions where I don't have a choice. I have to fly into there, and I suffer like everyone else. But, so I don't know. Either I fly into LAX, and then I get a flight up to Portland, or, I don't know, maybe I could get a flight to JFK and then Washington, D.C., and then take a direct flight from Portland. The problem if I do that is I will probably spend more total time in the air, and that's a factor for me in terms of my time management and business productivity. I always try to say the least amount of time in the air. But anyway, we'll figure that out. Not a big deal. Just another chapter in the collapsing USA and the collapsing Western world. Cool. So today, I want to talk about a topic that gets regular play in this world, where people will say, well, according to this happiness study, this country is the happiest country in the world, or happier than that country, because look at this happiness study. They did this happiness study, and clearly it showed definitively and scientifically that this country is happier than that country. And I have analyzed this before. I am happy to do this again. I will tell you why most of these happiness indexes and happiness studies are complete and total bullshit. I mean complete bullshit for a number of reasons. I will get into that in this podcast. To be fair and balanced, like Fox News, I will also compare the opposite. I will also compare some of the freedom index rankings and show why often these are not super accurate, or accurate to a degree, depending on what they're measuring. And I've used some of these freedom indexes to prove some of my points. So I'm being objective here. I'm attacking what I disagree with. I'm also attacking things that I agree with. Because again, I'm objective. I have to give you the objective, rational realities and facts based on these things, even if I don't happen to like them. So I'll analyze both of these things. So let's attack the happiness studies first. So the first reason that these studies are bullshit is that when you ask people, how happy are you with this? When you ask people to self-identify and put labels on themselves, it tends to be super inaccurate. I will give you many examples I've used over the years. Many years ago, they're not saying this anymore, but many years ago, a bunch of right-wingers and Trump supporters got all excited and they creamed their jeans because they said, Caleb, Gen Z is conservative. Gen Z is conservative, Caleb. So once Gen Z gets a little older, they're going to save this country, Caleb, because they're conservative. Now, why were these idiots, right-wingers, why did these people think that Gen Z was conservative? Gen Z is one of the most left-wing generations in world history. But these guys really thought Gen Z was conservative. And I wrote a whole article at my blogs, you can go look it up, called Gen Z is not conservative. And I showed all the data points and all the facts showing these people were wrong. Today, like I said, these people have kind of realized, well, maybe we're conservative. But why is that? Well, there were two reasons. One reason was when they did surveys, they found that Gen Zers, at least a few years ago, not sure if that's true anymore, would go to church a little more often than millennials. Now, that's not saying much. Millennials don't go to church. Millennials are left-wing socialists. Of course, they're not going to go to church. So the Gen Zers were going to church a little teeny bit more often than millennials. Oh, see, they're conservative. Here's the problem. When you actually got into details and you asked the typical Gen Zer his opinion on political issues, on the welfare state, universal basic income, quote unquote free government health care, gun control, they were extreme leftists. They were left on everything. Just they went to church a little more. That's basically it. So you basically have extreme leftists who go to church a little more often than their millennial brothers. Does that mean they're conservative? No, but that's not even the main reason. The main reason was in many surveys, they asked these Gen Zers to self-identify. Are you a liberal? What would be the American version of liberal, left-winger? Or are you a conservative, or are you a centrist, or are you a libertarian? And Gen Zers, being young and being counterculture, said, oh yeah, I'm conservative. I'm conservative. Yeah, and they said it to be edgy or cool or different, not because that's actually how they actually thought. Again, when they analyzed these Gen Zers who said they were conservative, they found a whole bunch of left-wing viewpoints. So it's very dangerous to ask people to self-identify. Here's another common one. When you ask, this is done many times, when you ask the typical European, are you happy with your healthcare? The general answer you'll get is, yes, I'm happy with it. But when you delve into it, when you continue to ask them, instead ask them questions about how long do you have to typically wait to see a doctor? Can you get a blood test literally whenever you want? Can you see your doctor whenever you want? When you have to get a procedure done or a surgery, how long do you typically have to wait? You get these horrific answers, at least answers that an American would consider horrific, that an American would never tolerate. So does it matter if the person self-identifies as happy with their healthcare, if they have to wait these weeks or months for procedures and or they have much less medical freedom than an American does? No, you don't ask people, are you happy? Are you sad? Are you a Christian? Are you a liberal? You don't ask them to self-identify. Instead, you ask them the deeper questions and then you derive from that. Matter of fact, I think I've told this story once before. Maybe I haven't, I don't remember. Many, many years ago, way back in the 90s, there was a big debate back then when Bill Clinton was president and Hillary Clinton attempted Hillary Care, where it was basically Obamacare or something very similar to that. And there was a big debate back then in the 90s that, oh no, Hillary's going to socialize healthcare, which is exactly what Obama ended up doing and what Trump ended up supporting. The reason they called it repeal and replace is because Trump liked Obamacare, so he didn't want to just repeal it. He wanted to replace it with some other big government program. Anyway, I'm digressing. But my point is that was the debate back then. And I was at an office party, a dinner party at my boss's house. And there were some pretty heavy hitters in that room, business owners and politicians and people like that. And we were sitting in some couches, like a U-shaped set of couches, talking to a bunch of people. And there was a woman who was a European. And I don't remember because it was so long ago. This was like, 30 years ago, 25 years ago. It was so long ago. I don't remember what European country she was from. I don't remember, and I wish I could tell you because it would help the story a little bit. But she was from a European country. She had a very thick European accent. And she basically said, she didn't use these words, but this is basically what she said. She goes, you Americans don't realize what the hell you're doing. At some point, and she was right, you guys are going to socialize your healthcare system or de facto socialize your healthcare system, and you're going to hate it. And if you point to Europeans and say, well, it works great in Europe, you Americans are idiots. That's not how this works. Americans are not Europeans. If the typical European mom calls the doctor and says, my son has this problem, I need to come in and see you. And the doctor says, great, you can come in 3 weeks. The typical European mom, and yes, there are exceptions, but the typical European goes, okay, and they're cool with it. They just deal with it. She said, is that you Americans? No, you Americans would freak the fuck out. A typical American mom, and yes, there are exceptions, if she was told if her son was something wrong with her son had sniffles or whatever, runny nose or coughing or, had trouble breathing or whatever hell it was, and they actually said, all right, we can fit you in 3 weeks from now, she would blow a fucking gasket. She would be down at the hospital screaming and ranting because that's how Americans are. Americans are much more impatient than Europeans. Americans don't tolerate stuff the way Europeans do. Europeans are much more even-keeled than Americans. So, of course, Europeans will say they're quote-unquote happy with their healthcare system because that's how Europeans are. Now, I will give you another corollary. One of the many reasons that Australia has basically become a totalitarian land of Mordor terror is because the people don't have any guns. If the people had guns, the government would never attempt this shit. Now, why don't Australians have guns? Well, many of you know, back in the 90s or so, the government said to all their people, Australians, turn in your guns. You know what the Australians said? They said, okay, and they handed their guns over. Now, if you're an American, that's comical. Would that ever happen? Would anything like that ever happen in the United States? Particularly in the southern states or the red states. No, you'd have blood in the streets because Americans are not Australians. So you cannot compare happiness studies from one country to happiness studies in another country. I promise you that quote unquote happiness is very different to the typical Japanese man than the typical American man, than the typical American man, and then the typical Argentinian man. Different cultures define happiness differently. That's why it's very difficult to compare happiness rankings from one culture to another. You can rank them similarly in similar cultures. So for example, you could have a happiness study that only focused on the 4 Scandinavian countries, right? You could interview Norwegians and Finlanders and, whatever, Swedes. And out of those 4 countries, you could possibly figure out which is the happiest of those 4 because they have very similar cultures. But as soon as you add Japan in there or Angola in there, you're going to get some weird results. So that's reason number 1. You cannot listen to self-identification, especially when you're dealing with a different culture. It doesn't work that way. The second big reason why a lot of these happiness studies are complete bullshit, and this is something that shocked me when I first delved into this, you can't just look at a happiness study and look at the rankings and say, oh, okay, Ireland is the happiest country in the world, or whatever country. It's not the happiest country in the world, but whatever that is. You can't just say, oh, Sweden is the happiest country in the world. Okay, and then just run away and just go tell everybody that Sweden's the happiest country in the world. No, as I've said many times, I have certainly discussed this in my Alpha Male 2.0 content when people look at divorce statistics. You can't just look at a number and go, that's the number, and then tell everybody. You have to go into the statistical studies and see how they determine that number. And it's the same thing with these happiness studies. When you go into the studies, and you got to get into the fine print, and I have. I spent hours looking into these years ago. When you really dig into how exactly did you come to this conclusion, what are the factors that you're using to draw this conclusion, you find all kinds of stupid shit in there. When you dig into them, you find that they're including things like welfare state programs. Are there a lot of welfare state programs? Is the government spending a lot of money on bankrupt welfare state programs? Well, if they are, they mark that as a positive toward happiness. What? Wait a minute. Huh? No. And I will repeat this. I've said this thousands of times. The Canadian healthcare system, government-run healthcare system, is bankrupt. The UK's government-run healthcare system is bankrupt. France's government-run healthcare system is bankrupt. And whenever you tell left-wingers that, they just run away or they change the topic. It doesn't fucking work. So no. Then they'll throw other things in there like GDP per capita. GDP per capita? What is the highest GDP per capita country in the world? Or one of them, if you remove the little countries like Luxembourg? United States. Are Americans happy? No, Americans are some of the most miserable, angry, depressed, sad, whatever people, not only in the entire Western world, but the entire world. What the fuck? So GDP, plus, I've said this before, I don't like GDP as a measurement of anything in terms of economic growth because GDP includes government spending. So all you have to do if you're a country is print up a bunch of money or borrow a bunch of money or jack up the taxes on your people or what have you, spend an extra hunk of billion, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars, and then voila, suddenly your GDP has gone up and everyone says, wow, that country's doing great. Their GDP is increasing. No, that company's doing terrible. They've increased government spending and they've just gotten closer and closer to economic collapse. Stupid. Other things like life expectancy. Well, life expectancy is good, but how does that relate to happiness? Not really. You're really drawing some weird lines here. Other things like the cost of long distance phone calls. What? What the fuck? What does that have to do with happiness in terms of the overall happiness of the people there? No. Now here's the other side of this. It's not just what they include, all the silly shit. It's the things they don't include. It's the things they omit. They will never consider debt of the government. Because the more debt your government has, the more likely you're going to be stressed out as a people because of taxes, inflation, monetary printing, government spending, government going to war, basic things like this. Also, they don't cover debt of the average person. What the hell? You cannot have a happiness study without factoring debt of the average individual. Because if you have a lot of debt, you're going to be less happy. If you have little to no debt, you'll be happier. I talk about that a lot in my Alpha 2.0 content. That's insanity, and none of these happiness studies include debt of the average person. They don't include things like rising crime rates. If crime rates are on the rise, they don't include these things. Some of them don't include crime rates at all. What the fuck? No. So if you have rising crime rates, that's indicative of a country that is less happy. Things like social unrest, political unrest, weakness of the currency, inflation rates, none of these are factored in, none of them. So they include all these happy-go-lucky fun statistics from the government, but they ignore all the ones that really would affect the actual happiness of the people. So anytime you see any of these happiness studies or someone says such and such is the happiest country in the world, or such and such ranks much higher on the happiness index, the World Happiness Index, than this country, so why would you move to that country? Delve into, or ask the person saying that to delve into how this was determined. What were the factors they actually used? Now, here's the last thing about this. This is interesting. Regardless of how happy or unhappy people are in a country, that doesn't necessarily mean that you may be happy living there. Okay? For example, I think people in Thailand are pretty happy. That's a pretty happy group of folks over there. I would hate living in Thailand. I would hate living in Thailand. Visiting, fine. I would hate living there. I would hate living in Bangkok. I would hate living in a place like Chiang Mai. That is just not the kind of place I want to live in. I would be fucking miserable if I lived in Thailand. Yet, the Thai people are pretty happy people as you compare to other countries. I believe they are. So that's fine. You can make the same argument for Scandinavians. Scandinavians are reasonably happy people because of mostly cultural differences between them and the United States and other places like that. But if I lived in Scandinavia and I had to pay those taxes, no thanks, man. Scandinavia is beautiful. I have friends in Scandinavia, but I would never want to live there. Now let's flip this around. Japan. Are Japanese people really happy? No. Japanese people are stressed out. They're very repressed. They're walking around with their teeth clenched all the time. It's kind of funny going there. These are not the happiest people on earth, nowhere close. But I could totally live in Japan, even though Japan is collapsing. I'm not saying I'm going to live in Japan, but I could. If you put a gun to my head and forced me to live in Japan, I would make that work and I'd be okay living there. Be perfectly fine living there because there are aspects to Japan I really enjoy, aspects of the people I really enjoy. And so even though Japan may not rank very high on the happiness studies, and maybe they do, I don't know, but I would be perfectly fine living there. The bottom line is you have to determine what makes you happy as an individual, not what makes people happy in Fiji or Colombia or Bangladesh or Sweden or Australia. These are different cultures, and you may or may not be from that culture, and you may or may not be compatible with people in that culture. I'll use my home of Dubai. There are many of you who would hate living here in Dubai. You would hate it. You would fucking hate it. There are many of you who would love living here. Oh my God, for a certain type of guy, Dubai is a fucking paradise. I've been here a year now, and I love it. But I know for a fact there are plenty of guys who would hate living in Dubai. They would hate it. Some guys don't even like visiting Dubai. I don't understand that. Dubai's a pretty cool place to visit. But anyway, you should use a happiness index as a factor and perhaps maybe an indicator, although probably not even that for the reasons we've covered, but not as a deciding factor for why would you live here instead of here when this country ranks higher. It's not that simple. And by the way, standard sovereign CEO advice, before you move to any country, you should spend at least a week or two there several times at different times during the year. I've given that advice a lot. Don't just say, I'm going to move to this country because I heard on the internet people like it. No. Everybody likes Chiang Mai. Everybody likes Medellin. You may hate Chiang Mai and Medellin. Go there for a week. Get an Airbnb, pretend you live there, buy groceries as if you live there, walk around, talk to people, really experience it as if you live there, not a tourist. You can do the tourist shit too, I guess, the first time. And then go, wait a few months and go again. Wait a few months and go again. And if you still love it after all that, then move there. Fine. All right, let me quickly switch gears and talk about the economic indexes of freedom. Specifically, I'm going to pull it up here on my screen. And so these are freedom rankings, okay? So the freedom index I typically refer to is what's called the Index of Economic Freedom. You can go to heritage.org/index, and that lists every country in the world ranked in order of how free it is. Just one problem, especially lately. In a post-cerveza sickness world, this index doesn't really work anymore. It's never been 100%, but it has been okay. I'm looking at it right now, 2021 Index of Economic Freedom. As of 2021, I don't know the date in 2021, but I'm going to read the top 10 freest countries according to this index in 2021, okay? Number 1, Singapore. Okay, fine. Number 2, New Zealand. What? Huh? Okay. Number 3, Australia. Okay. No. Australia is basically like Nazi Germany right now. I'm exaggerating. You know what I mean. People are not allowed to go more than 3 miles from their home. The entire country is completely locked down. They're not letting their own citizens back into their country. Or I believe you can leave, but you can't come back. It's insanity over there. Yet the 2021 Index of Economic Freedom marks Australia as the 3rd freest country in the world. Ugh. Now, the one possible thing here is that these numbers and data were compiled in early 2021 before a lot of these things were happening. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know. Let's continue. Number 4 is Switzerland. Okay, maybe. Number 5 is Ireland. Okay, maybe. Number 6 is Taiwan. Number 7, UK. Number 8, Estonia. Number 9, Canada. Canada now? No. Now again, maybe Canada a year ago, maybe. And number 10, Denmark. Denmark is a welfare state nightmare, right? Right. Okay. So some of these make sense and some of them don't. So let me click on one at random. I'll click on Australia here. And I will give you, I did another video on YouTube actually about this called Is America Free? You can look that up, where I go through the freedom rankings comparing on the United States to Singapore and Estonia, and where the United States was high and where it was low. And in there, I mentioned some of these factors. But basically, here are the factors it uses. Property rights, I would say that's valid. Judicial effectiveness, okay, maybe somewhat effective. Government integrity, I don't know if that's important to freedom. As I've talked about many times, I can go live in a country where the government pretty much sucks, and I can have more freedom on a day-to-day personal level than I could in a big, giant, bloated government like the United States or UK. I experience more personal freedom living in Paraguay, which has a very corrupt government, than I do living in the United States or UK or Australia with a, in theory, more honorable, less corrupt government. So again, you really don't need to factor that in there. Next one is tax burden. I agree that should be factored, absolutely. Government spending, I agree that should be factored. Fiscal health, that's a gray area. So what does that mean exactly? I'm not going to delve into that right now, but what exactly, when you say fiscal health, that can mean all kinds of things. How much money the banks have because the government has printed up $5 trillion like Donald Trump did 2 years ago because of cerveza sickness. Does that mean that's good for fiscal health? That'd be good for fiscal health, but that'd be terrible for freedom, right? Next one is business freedom. Good. I agree with that. Labor freedom. Good. I agree with that. Monetary freedom. I do agree with that. But again, I'd have to delve into what they mean by that. What do you mean exactly by monetary freedom? I can buy Bitcoin. I don't know. Next factor is trade freedom. I somewhat agree with that. That's a free trade versus fair trade is a very complicated issue. Free trade made Hong Kong into the number one most vibrant economy in the world in less than a 40-year time frame, which has literally never happened in the history of the world because they were a 100% free trade country. So I agree free trade is good, but I also agree that there are some times where free trade is bad, but it's really nation dependent. So I think that's oversimplifying a little bit. Next one is investment freedom and financial freedom. And in both those, yes, they sound good, but just like happiness studies or happiness, I'd have to dig into where and how they're pulling those numbers. So that's how these freedom indexes can be a little inaccurate, even though I have personally used them. But I've said at the time, hey, these numbers are not 100% accurate, but to give you an idea. If I had a lot more money and a lot more free time, both of which I do not have at the moment, I would set up my own index. And I would take several $1 million and fund my own research studies and have a real happiness index that was actually accurate, a worldwide happiness index, and a real worldwide freedom index on how free the individual would be living in that country versus this country. And I would take out all the bullshit. I would not ask people to self-identify and look at those factors that would actually work. I'm never going to do that. That's pie in the sky. I have other plans for my mission. But I think you see my point. I want you to be aware of these things as people quote these things on the internet or as you hear them discussed on the internet. It's not nearly as simple as people say. You can't just glance at an index and say, oh, that's right. You've got to do a little extra research on your part. I know that takes time, but especially here at Sovereign CEO, when you're looking at less bad countries to move to, less bad countries to use as flags, places to set up your business, places to live, to avoid taxes or live a more free life, places to avoid the collapsing West. You've got to be aware of these things. Cool? Cool. All right. That's it. I will see you in the next podcast. Have fun. Bye.